Some of the best GA planes has been called a killer at some point in their history. Some of them earned the name, but most of them didn't. But the thing is that in aviation, it doesn't matter. Once there is one bad accident report, a perfectly good airplane will spend the rest of its life dragging around a reputation it never earned. So let's talk about what actually went wrong with some of the most infamous planes in general aviation. Number 1. The SR22 is probably the most polarizing one here, because the feature that was supposed to save lives is the same feature that earned it a bad reputation. The Cirrus SR22 is arguably the best high-performance piston single on the market right now, and it's been the best-selling general aviation airplane in the world every year since 2002. But the thing that really set it apart was caps, a whole airplane ballistic parachute built into the airframe from the factory. You'd think strapping a parachute to an airplane would be universally praised, but many traditional pilots mocked the idea. Some said, "Real pilots fly the airplane to the ground." Others said the parachute would attract less disciplined pilots who'd use it as a crutch. And when accidents started showing up, critics pointed straight at caps and said, "Told you so." But the real issue was the pilot demographic. SR-22 buyers were often newer to flying, stepping into a fast, highly automated airplane early in their careers. And when emergencies did happen, pilots hesitated to pull the handle, trying to salvage situations that were already unrecoverable instead of deploying the chute early. Training eventually caught up. Cirrus reframed caps as a primary safety device, not a last-ditch option. Accident rates improved, and caps saves steadily accumulated. As of late 2025, the system has been successfully deployed over 140 times, saving close to 300 lives. Over 10,000 SR series aircraft have been delivered, making it the most produced general aviation airplane of the 21st century. Number 2. The Bonanza's signature feature was its distinctive butterfly tail, two angled surfaces replacing the conventional horizontal stabilizer and vertical fin. It was lighter, produced less drag, and gave the airplane a silhouette that was instantly recognizable on any ramp. Back in the late 1940s, the Bonanza was also one of the first civilian airplanes to feature retractable landing gear, and it was remarkably fast for its era. It attracted buyers with deep pockets, oftentimes doctors or lawyers who didn't always possess the skill to match the airplane. And a lethal pattern began to emerge. A non-instrument-rated pilot would blunder into the clouds and rapidly become disoriented. They'd enter a steep spiral descent, and the moment they broke out and saw the ground rushing up, they'd yank back on the elevator. That imposed catastrophic loads on the V-Tail, and in many cases, it buckled entirely. So this is a bit simplified because there are structural issues in the story too, and the FAA mandated structural reinforcements to the tail section. Because the pilots in these crashes were so disproportionately doctors, the nickname cemented itself permanently. Tragically, musicians Buddy Holly, Ritchie Valens, and the Big Bopper perished in a Bonanza crash in 1959, an event that became known as the day the music died. The pilot, Roger Peterson, was not instrument-rated and flew into deteriorating weather, a textbook case of the exact pattern that had been claiming Bonanza pilots for years. Despite shouldering one of the harshest reputations in general aviation, the Bonanza endures as one of the most successful airplanes ever produced. About 14,000 V-Tail models were built before the Model 35 line ended in 1982. Number 3. The PA-38 is what you get when you survey flight instructors on what would make the perfect trainer and build exactly that. So in the mid-1970s, Piper sent questionnaires to more than 10,000 instructors and used that feedback to shape the airplane. Instructors wanted serious visibility, 2 doors, a simple fuel system, heavier controls, and an aircraft that could actually be used for spin training. Piper gave them exactly that. The result was a small 2-seat trainer powered by a 112 horsepower Lycoming, built with a T-tail, and designed to behave the way instructors said a real trainer should. And that is where the Tomahawk's reputation was made. One of the key things instructors wanted was honest spin behavior. They did not want an airplane that hid bad habits from students. They wanted one that would enter a spin properly and force the pilot to use the correct recovery technique. The Tomahawk absolutely did that. It will go into a fully developed spin, and it expects the pilot to recover it correctly. A Cessna 150 is far more forgiving and will often try to recover almost by itself. The Tomahawk does no such thing. Part of that comes down to the T-tail. In a developed spin, the airflow behind the wing and fuselage becomes badly disturbed. Because the horizontal stabilizer sits high up on the fin, that airflow can blanket out, reducing elevator authority right when the pilot most needs it. That means recovery has to be deliberate: full opposite rudder, neutral ailerons, and forward elevator. Even then, once those inputs are applied, the airplane can briefly tighten and accelerate before finally breaking out into a steep nose-down recovery. That recovery phase is where things can go wrong fast. If the pilot is late, rough, or unprepared, the airplane can pick up speed quickly, and the pullout can impose heavy G-loads or even push the airframe toward an overspeed. In a training environment where low-time pilots are already operating close to the edge of their skill, that made the Tomahawk far less forgiving than many people expected from a basic trainer. That combination of demanding spin characteristics and constant use in the training world gave the airplane a dark reputation. The PA-38 picked up nicknames like Traumahawk and Terrorhawk, and those names stuck. Number 4. The Grumman American AA-1 goes back to one of the most famous names in light aircraft design, Jim BD. The AA-1 Yankee started life as the BD-1, a design BD originally intended to sell as a kit plane. That plan did not last. The aircraft was eventually certified for factory production and entered the market as a sleek little personal traveler, first under American Aviation, then Grumman, and later Gulfstream. On paper, it looked like something flight schools would love. It had side-by-side seating, tricycle landing gear, and a sliding canopy that made it feel sportier than the average trainer. And that is exactly the problem. A lot of schools bought it thinking it could fill the trainer role, but the Yankee had never really been designed for that kind of work. It had light, sensitive controls, a limited useful load, and stall behavior that could get aggressive if mishandled. That is where its reputation started to turn. The FAA originally certified the Yankee for spins, but in service, pilots kept reporting the same thing. Once the airplane went beyond a turn, recovery could become very difficult. That was serious enough that 5 years into production, the FAA stepped in, removed the spin certification, and required a spins prohibited placard in the cockpit. Early on, the airplane built a poor safety record. Some accidents came from spin training in an airframe that did not tolerate it well. Others came from fuel starvation and obstacle strikes on takeoff. In other words, the Yankee entered service with a mix of sporty handling and narrow margins, and that combination could catch people out fast. But that is not where the story ended. Over time, the airplane went through a series of refinements that improved both safety and performance, and the design gradually grew into a far better machine than it had been at the start. Once those rough edges were addressed, pilots began to appreciate what the Yankee actually was. It was not a forgiving ab initio trainer. It was a sporty, efficient little airplane with sharp handling, a comfortable cabin, a 110-knot cruise, and one of the most distinctive canopies in its class. Between 1968 and 1978, about 1,800 were built, and plenty are still flying today. Number 5. The Skymaster was built to solve one of the oldest problems in twin-engine flying: asymmetric thrust. In a normal twin, lose an engine, and the airplane yaws hard toward the dead side, which is exactly the kind of thing that has caught pilots out for decades. Cessna's answer was clever. Put one engine in the nose, one in the tail, and keep them both on the center line. That way, if one quits, there is no big yawing moment trying to drag the airplane off course. The Skymaster was sold as the twin that flew like a single, and for pilots moving up from single-engine aircraft, that sounded almost ideal. But that same solution created a trap of its own. When the rear engine failed, the airplane often gave the pilot very little warning. There was no dramatic yaw, almost no obvious trim change, and even the sound difference could be subtle. A pilot could start the takeoff roll or lift off believing both engines were making full power, when in reality, the rear engine was dead or only producing partial power. By the time the problem became obvious, the airplane was already airborne, dragging itself along with weak climb performance and very little margin left. Cessna knew this was an issue, so the company built procedures around it. Pilots were taught to advance the rear throttle first, listen carefully for the change in engine note, and confirm on the gauges that both engines were producing power before committing to the takeoff. On paper, that made sense, but in the real world, pilots did not always follow that script precisely. And accident reports kept circling back to the same pattern. Rear engine failure, cues missed, takeoff continued, then an airplane struggling to climb with nowhere left to go. That problem became serious enough that the FAA treated the Skymaster as its own category for training. It got a separate multi-engine class rating for centerline thrust only, which meant time in a 337 did not qualify a pilot to fly a conventional twin. That alone tells you how different the airplane really was. And yet the Skymaster itself was not a bad machine. Cessna built more than 2,000 civilian examples between 1963 and 1980, along with about 330 pressurized models and more than 500 military O2 variants. Number 6. The Mitsubishi MU-2 was one of the most serious turboprops ever aimed at both military and civilian use. Developed in Japan, it came in both short and stretched fuselage versions, and even today it stands among the fastest turboprop twins ever built, cruising at around 370 miles per hour. When it entered the market, it was priced low enough to pull in plenty of ambitious buyers, and that is where the trouble began. Because the airplane was relatively compact and light, pilots in the United States could step into it with little more than a standard multi-engine rating and an instructor sign-off. On paper, that made the MU-2 look accessible. In reality, it was anything but. The airplane behaved far more like a small jet than a typical piston twin, and many of the pilots climbing into it simply did not have the background, discipline, or systems knowledge to handle it properly. And that mismatch showed up in the accident record. As the years went on, the U.S. accident rate kept climbing badly enough that the FAA launched a formal investigation into the airplane's safety. When the FAA dug into the data, its conclusion was that the airplane itself was not inherently unsafe. Properly flown, it was a safe and extremely capable machine. The real problem was that too many pilots were getting into it without training that matched the airplane's performance and demands. So the FAA took the unusual step of creating a special federal aviation regulation, or SFAR, specifically for the MU-2. That sharply raised the training standard required to fly it, and the safety record improved significantly once that happened. By then, the MU-2 had already earned one of the harshest nicknames in aviation, the Mitsubishi Widowmaker. Number 7. The Piper Aerostar was built around one thing: speed. With its slim fuselage, clean mid-wing layout, turbocharged engines, and, in some versions, cabin pressurization, it gave buyers a piston twin that could run with airplanes far above its class. Depending on the model, cruise speed sat around 220 knots and pushed past 260 knots in the later turbocharged versions. For someone moving up from a Bonanza or a Baron, the Aerostar looked like the next big step. A fast, sleek machine that could carry you straight into the flight levels. But that performance came with very little patience. The real danger showed up when an engine failed after takeoff or during the climb. That is already one of the most critical moments in any light twin, but in an Aerostar, the margins could disappear fast. The airplane would often be heavy, pitched up, and carrying a lot of drag. When one engine quit, it did not give the pilot time to think slowly. The response had to be immediate and exact. Lower the nose, clean up the drag, hold blue line speed, trim the airplane, then identify and deal with the dead engine. A lot of step-up owners were simply behind it. Some pulled power back because they were trying to be gentle on the airplane. Others let the airspeed bleed away while they tried to work out which engine had failed. And that is where the Aerostar could turn vicious. Speed would decay, the airplane would sink toward VMC, roll toward the dead engine, and if that happened close to the ground, we both know the outcome. That is what built the Aerostar's reputation. It got labeled unforgiving, even though the deeper problem was usually the pilot, not the airplane. Many owners were bringing single-engine habits into a machine that demanded true multi-engine discipline. The Aerostar was not interested in easing you into the workload. It expected you to know the numbers, fly them exactly, and react without hesitation. Number 8. Piper Malibu was built to be the next big step in airplane ownership. It promised the kind of capability private pilots dreamed about: pressurization, air conditioning, cabin comfort, serious speed, and the ability to climb high above weather in a single-engine package. For owners moving up from simpler singles, the Malibu looked like the airplane that finally let you play in the same airspace as the big boys. At first, the reception was strong. But early on, the airplane began to develop a troubling record of engine problems, especially in the original Continental-powered Malibus, where hot-running issues and a string of failures started to stain the type's reputation. Then the story got much worse. Between May 1989 and March 1991, 7 Malibu and Mirage accidents drew intense attention because they involved departures from controlled flight, and several ended in in-flight breakups. That pushed the NTSB and FAA into a full-scale investigation of the airplane, its systems, and the way it was being flown. The focus quickly turned toward the flight guidance system, operations in instrument conditions, icing, pilot technique, and whether pilots were getting into trouble faster than they could recover. The FAA responded with restrictions, but not a blanket ban on all instrument flying. The directive prohibited PA-46 operations in known or forecast icing, thunderstorms, and moderate to severe turbulence, and it also limited certain autopilot and trim uses while the investigation was underway. That decision infuriated owners because the whole point of buying a Malibu was to fly high, fast, and in real weather. After the special certification review, the broad suspicion around the airplane eased. The NTSB's findings pointed toward a familiar pattern: pitot heat not being used in freezing IMC, possible misuse of the integrated flight guidance system, loss of control, and structural overload after pilots put the airplane outside its limits. In other words, the design was scrutinized hard, but the final picture still came back to pilot handling, system management, and training. Number 9. The Lancair IV-P has performance numbers that sound almost unreal for a home built, and a safety record that reads like a warning. The Lancair IV-P is a 4-seat pressurized composite kit plane powered by a 350 horsepower twin-turbocharged Continental. It can cruise at around 280 to 290 knots up in the flight levels and operate as high as 29,000 feet. For an experimental airplane, that is serious speed. But that performance came from a very deliberate compromise. The IV-P was designed around a tiny, thin, laminar flow wing, just 98 square feet, carrying a gross weight of 3,550 pounds. That gives it a wing loading of about 32 pounds per square foot, which is enormous for a light airplane. That wing was built to go fast in cruise. It was never built to be forgiving down near the stall, and when it runs out of lift, it does not give you a gentle warning. It can drop a wing and depart abruptly, which is exactly the kind of behavior that becomes deadly close to the ground. A lot of pilots looked at it and saw a bargain turboprop substitute, something that could deliver cabin-class speed without cabin-class money. But the airplane demanded far more discipline than that mindset usually brings. You had to fly wide patterns, stay ahead of the speed, respect the wing, and never try to force it around the corner. The moment you flew it casually, like a slower and softer piston single, it could turn on you fast. Around 360 IVs and IVPs were completed before kit production ended in 2012. In disciplined hands, the airplane can be an astonishing machine. Fast, efficient, and capable of covering huge distances at speeds most piston aircraft cannot touch. But its legacy was written by the same trade-off that made it so impressive in the first place. The Lancair IV-P chased speed relentlessly, and down near the stall, it collected the bill. Number 10. The Glassair III was built to be a rocket, and it absolutely flies like one. It arrived in 1986 as an all-composite retractable gear kit plane with a 300 horsepower Lycoming up front, and it delivered performance that sat well beyond most certified singles. Its wing is tiny for the weight it carries, about 81 square feet supporting a 2,400-pound gross weight, and that is the whole point of the airplane. It was designed to trade easy, low-speed manners for serious cruise performance. That is why the Glassair III became such a dream machine for homebuilders who wanted something far quicker than the usual Cherokee or RV step-up. But that same design logic is exactly what makes the airplane demanding near the ground. High wing loading, quick control response, and limited room for sloppy energy management mean the Glassair III does not forgive the kind of pattern mistakes a trainer might shrug off. AOPA noted that its early accident spike in the 1990s was serious enough to send insurance costs through the roof, and the handling qualities that made it exciting in cruise were part of what made it unforgiving for pilots who showed up undertrained or behind the airplane. That is why the type developed such a hard-edged reputation. It was never really about the airplane being random or evil. It was about a very fast home built that expected the pilot to stay ahead of it all the time. And that is the real Glassair III story. Flown with discipline, proper transition training, and respect for its speed, it is one of the most thrilling fast cruisers in the experimental world. But flown casually, especially in the pattern where speed, bank angle, and judgment all tighten at once, it can punish mistakes brutally. Several hundred were completed worldwide, and after the Glassair II and III assets were acquired by Advanced Aero Components in 2017, the line continued in updated form under the G3 name. So the Glassair III never stopped being what it was from day one, a compact, home-built hot rod that delivers huge performance but asks for real pilot discipline in return. So that's it for today's video. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell. It goes a long way for us.